Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the United Nations Association UK. Welcome to those of you in person here in Whitehall Court who have braved the heat wave and the possible hangovers of those who lamented England's defeat last night. And welcome to more than 100 people who I know are joining us online to take part in this discussion. I just wanted to say a word about UNA UK's work on this incredibly important selection process to find the leader who will be the next UN Secretary General, which is the context of which we are all here. This is obviously a pivotal time for the UN, and this selection process is acutely important. But the Secretary General's role is always vital. And it was 10 years ago that UNA UK started to work as part of what was then the One for 7 Billion campaign, now renamed the One for 8 Billion campaign because of the global population growth in that time. We wanted to try to shed light on a process that had always been very private and very hidden from the public, of how the states on the Security Council select their preferred candidate, which is then passed to the General Assembly for consideration. The UK government has a role in this process, and each candidate comes here and is meeting with the Foreign Secretary as part of their campaigning. Civil society does not have a vote, but there are things we can all do to try to encourage our governments, including through our MPs, to make sure that the UK is supporting a candidate that will stand for the fundamental principles of the UN, and that will look at the inevitable reforms and probable more budget cuts with an eye to advancing real problem solving and principled purpose, and that this is a particularly critical time to be making that choice. As many of you know, we hosted 4 of the then 5 candidates back in May for an engagement with civil society, and we had questions pouring in from people around the world that were put to the candidates. Now, the candidate who is with us today, Ambassador Rodrigues Birkett, she has been nominated by Guyana on the 15th of June, so she is the newest entrant to this selection process, and I've just learned also the youngest. And so we didn't have an opportunity to meet her in May, but we are very grateful that she is making the time on this visit to Europe. She was in France yesterday and is in London today, and will be meeting with the Foreign Secretary in about 2 hours' time, at which point I believe the Foreign Secretary will still be the Foreign Secretary. And we really appreciate that she's making the time in this brief and important visit to engage with us and you, and to treat civil society as a valued partner in the process, because we know civil society will be a vital partner for a new Secretary General if they are to wield the soft power that the UN can wield around the world. So with that, I will let the conversation begin. I'm delighted to hand the microphone to Mark Lobel from the BBC, who's kindly moderating today's discussion. Thank you so much.
Jane, thank you very much. Yes, well, thank you for joining us, Carolyn. Thank you for squeezing us in as the warm-up to the Foreign Secretary. We'll do our best to get you ready for that chat. This is the latest hustings, as Jane said, and the newest candidate, revealed here, youngest candidate, to be that world's top diplomat with 8 billion citizens to look after. And I think it all begins in January 2027, so not long to go to find out who that's going to be and for them to start in the role. Carolyn Rodrigues Birkett, it's great to have you here. A warm welcome. In the most transparent, I think, process ever for a Secretary General that's taken place. Obviously speaking here live from central London at the United Nations Association UK. Hello to everybody watching online. And yeah, we're all reeling from a certain football match last night, losing to a South American country. But they speak Spanish there, not English as their first language. So that's a big difference, right? Yeah, you're nodding. You feel our pain, I hope, Carolyn. Yeah, and just a brief introduction. I'm Mark Lobel, a journalist and presenter. I've been working with the BBC for 23 years as a foreign correspondent, political correspondent, but I cut my teeth at the United Nations, Millennium Summit, for Interpress Service in those days, and rubbing shoulders with Vladimir Putin and Tony Blair. When Kofi Annan was the Secretary General, there's been 2 men since then, never a woman yet. But that might be something that might change. Who knows? We will see. And of course, I'm also a podcaster. I mention that because I'm a co-host of a podcast with Jane. And one of the podcasts that we did in January, also in association with this United Nations Association, was is this the UN's last chance to save the world? And we're talking about peace and security, the climate crisis, the rule of law, and that's the question for this race for Secretary General. And the question is, could it be Carolyn? Could it be you? So just a brief introduction to Carolyn for those of you who don't know. Guyana's permanent representative at the United Nations. You also led Guyana's delegation at the United Nations Security Council, and also chairperson of the G77 and China for Guyana's delegation there. So, when I look right back, you started as an elementary school teacher, and then you rose to Guyana's Minister of Foreign Affairs. So we really look forward to kind of hearing about all of this, your rise to being an international diplomat, an international lawyer. And have I missed anything out from your CV there?
No, you've covered the main things.
A couple of main things. Okay, well, so let me just briefly outline the format for the next hour or so. So there's going to be an opening statement, Carolyn, of 5 minutes. I'll keep you to time. And then we're going to have 30 minutes of questions. I'll ask a couple of questions, but mainly the questions that have been submitted and vetted by the United Nations Association from a wide range of people, really to give you a scope of what the big issues people care about are for this job. So the biggest job interview you can ever have live here at the UNA UK. And then I'm going to open the floor to you. And I can tell you that I can already tell this is a very clever audience, a very smart audience. So they're going to be listening to you every word. So they'll be following up anything that I miss out. So let's start with your opening statement, if we may. We obviously want to hear about the focus of your campaign to lead the UN on the world stage. So the question is, what is the most important thing you want this audience here and watching online to understand about why you're seeking this position and what you would do with it?
Well, thank you, Mark, and I'm sorry about the football. And you're right, Guyana is the only English-speaking country on the continent, and we got English from you. So that's part of why I'm torn. But Argentina is on the continent as well as South America. But today, I think the discussion is where we would focus on just getting the goal in one box by all of us, and that's for the UN, working to a single goal in one direction, I would say. And to your point about, or your question about why and what I am looking to do. Why? Because I believe that over the years, coming from the ground up, I have gained quite a lot of experience from you mentioned my short stint as a teacher, but I worked in the field for 7 years with indigenous communities before moving on to being the Minister of Indian Affairs, then Foreign Affairs, and then into the UN as an international civil servant, and then working as a permanent representative to the UN. And so I've seen a spectrum of things that I believe would help me greatly in doing this job. But more than that, I believe in the UN. I really believe in the UN. It has been at the side of my country for many, many years. But I also see people in the UN that are working very hard every day to make this world a better place. But it's true, we're going through a lot of challenges right now. The proliferation of conflicts and the new way conflicts are being fought right now, where technology is being used, it's being weaponized. And so we're even removing the human emotions from conflicts, I would say, by using drones, by using these kinds of technology. We're nowhere near to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN faces a liquidity crisis. On top of that, we have to contend with the impacts of climate change and the questioning of multilateralism itself. So it is a time of great challenges, but I believe that it is in the times of great challenges that opportunities emerge as well. And the worst thing, the only worst thing than the challenges themselves is losing the opportunity that those challenges present. And this is where I believe the new Secretary General has to be a Secretary General that uses this occasion to see or to make the change insofar as the Secretary General can during this period. And so you need a Secretary General that is pragmatic and a Secretary General that is realistic as well. Of course, we all want an ideal UN, but during this period, I believe that we have to look at what is possible. And this is why the vision that I outlined is along those lines. Pragmatic, yet principled, with the only bias being to the UN Charter and international law. I believe that we can have a UN that learns from the past, that a UN that is fit for today, and a UN that is ready for the future. I really believe that. And the Secretary General would be able to contribute to that, working with member states at this point in time, in this same way of pragmatism, across all three pillars, because there are some who believe that one pillar is more important than the other. And what we have heard from member states, these all three pillars, human rights, development, and peace and security are equally important. And so if I start with peace and security, I have to admit that the UN is judged mainly through this lens, because people believe we are not able to end and prevent conflicts. And so peace and security, extremely important, where the focus must be on ending and preventing conflicts. And the Secretary General has a number of tools at her disposal. Mediation, good offices, a number of tools. And as Secretary General, I would want to use the tools at my disposal, even if it will make small incremental steps in moving to a solution where these conflicts are taking place. I'm not oblivious to the geopolitical situation, and many of these conflicts are caught up in that, but the Secretary General does not have the luxury of not trying. You have to try. And that is what I would do. I would present proposals to the Security Council, where the Security Council needs to address these matters, but I'll also use the tools at my disposal. Secondly, on the development side, we are not short of a blueprint. We have the Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDGs. The problem we have is in implementation. That's where the deficit is. And a large part of the reason for this deficit is access to finance, especially by developing countries. And that would be one of my priorities, working with the international financial institutions. Some work has already been done, but we need to make more progress here, even if it's incremental steps that would have a systemic impact and not just a single event impact. And so that would be my priority. In the reform process that we're going through right now in the UN, we have to safeguard where we've made development gains. We must not cut any of those activities that we're doing where we are seeing those gains. This is, of course, a member states-driven process, but as Secretary General, certainly this is something that I would want to emphasize. On the human rights side, if we have more peace, if we have more development, the dividends for human rights would go up immediately. But human rights must be across all the work of the United Nations. In addition to that, as Secretary General, I would use my voice to speak about non-discrimination, to speak about gender equality, because these are fundamental to human rights. And the last point I would make is on reform. There are two discussions on reform. Reform of the UN as in terms of the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the revitalization of the General Assembly, but they're the internal reforms that we are doing right now. Some work has already been done on this, on how we deal with mandates, on how we strengthen the Secretariat, make it more efficient and more effective. But the work that is currently ongoing on structural reform, structural alignment, which may result in some mergers of some UN agencies, funds and programs, or some mergers of functions, this is important work. And as Secretary General, I want to ensure that member states have the best information, objective information, neutral information that can help them to make the right decisions. 5 minutes up, I think.
Well done. So that's a roadmap on the 3 pillars and very clear. And we're going to drill down into those areas that you mentioned and your pragmatic approach that you're talking about adopting. But why you is the first question that anybody's going to ask. We mentioned chairing the G77. We mentioned there's a lot of work on climate vulnerability that you've done. You're from a small developing state, so you have that perspective. Now you're applying for the world's most senior diplomatic post. So what is it from your career that has uniquely developed you for the role of Secretary General?
As I mentioned earlier, I started in the field. I come from a country that not so long ago was a heavily indebted poor country. No one wants to have that acronym attached to their country. In 1992, we were paying 94 cents of every dollar in debt. No country can develop with that. And I've seen how the UN played a role in advocating for debt relief. When our country and other countries started to talk about this, it was, this is not going to happen. But the UN helped in that advocacy. And we were able to receive debt relief. And in a matter of less than 2 decades, our country fiscal situation improved significantly. And I've seen in recent times how investment in education, in health, in people, in development can transform a country. My country has moved from a heavily indebted country. And before my country discovered oil, we were already on a very good pathway of development. And so I believe that with the right finances, with the right policies and programs, that you can make significant transformational progress in a country. And I've been part of that. I've been part of both scenarios. As Minister of Amerindian Affairs, in my community that I'm from, I was born in an indigenous community, I am indigenous, where we had no secondary school at the time I was 17. And I've seen how the secondary schools that we've built throughout the country, how that transformed people's lives. That time, there was one indigenous doctor. Today, I can't count them on my fingers because of investment in people. And then, as Minister of Foreign Affairs, where I advocated a lot for fairness in the international system, concessional financing, vulnerability of countries and how we treat with that, part of the African, Caribbean, Pacific group, and so much wider than that. And so I have had basically the spectrum of the challenges, but also what's possible. And then I came to the Security Council while we were in the UN. And that, in a way, brought me very close to the peace and security agenda, the challenges, the complexities, but also what can be possible, but also the suffering of people in this world. Too many are suffering because of conflicts. And I have advocated, Mark, with many young people, never be afraid to put yourself forward when the opportunity arrives. This is not going to come back to my region until another 50 years' time. And I have to be true to my advice as well, to put myself up when those opportunities arise. And I believe with my experience, I've developed the expertise to do just that.
Okay, quite a journey, and also spelling out clearly there how you've been a witness to great change, which I'm sure lots of people would agree the world is crying out for. Let's just also ask you, before I move to the submitted questions, about principles for integrity. And Jane picked up on this earlier, the One for 8 Billion campaign, which the United Nations Association UK is a founding partner. So there are 5 principles that they've asked all candidates running for Secretary General to commit to: publishing financial disclosures, engaging with civil society throughout the campaign, participating transparently in General Assembly and Security Council processes, respecting Article 100 of the UN Charter, that's independence from member states, and avoiding conflicts of interest. So, first of all, in front of everybody here, I'm not going to give you the Bible, can you publicly commit to all those principles?
Yes.
Okay, I'll move on.
Yes.
With the last
yes,
two,
I can.
the last two,
But
yes.
the one on there's the
So
one
the
on,
last two about independence from member states and
Yes.
avoiding conflicts of interests. How do you draw the line then between running as a candidate for this most prestigious job and your official duties as an ambassador?
Well, first of all, my official duties as ambassador, I have, since I've announced this, I have not been speaking in any of the meetings in the UN, and I was co-facilitating a process that is about measuring growth beyond GDP. That's a very important process as well, as we look at tools to, for example, access to finance. For too long, we've been measuring only by GDP, which does not give the complete picture. And I removed myself from that. I've asked the President of the General Assembly to find someone else because I put myself forward. So I have removed myself from that to give me the space and the independence that I seek right now. Member states are basically my bosses, I would say. And so I have to work very closely with member states. But it's true, Article 100 about impartiality is extremely important. And I'll give you an example. I was twice president of the Security Council in the last 2 years. And as president of the Security Council, I had to make some very important decisions. And those decisions that I made were not even based on my country's position, even though we were there as Guyana, because you have to demonstrate impartiality if you want to see progress. I will not go into details what were some of those decisions, but at the end of both our presidency, Guyana was judged as fair and transparent. And I cannot remove myself as being the person leading the Guyana delegation then. But I just give you that one example. I will not conflate roles.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's turn to the questions now that have been submitted. And this is about climate, energy and youth. You touched on climate earlier. This has been submitted by Anirudh Janagam from the London Clean Energy Roundtable. They're in their 20s or 30s. And here's the question. In a world facing escalating climate, energy and geopolitical crises simultaneously, how would you strengthen collaboration between governments, industry, youth and civil society to accelerate practical implementation rather than only negotiations and commitments?
One of the challenges that I have seen is the ability of countries to respond to climate impacts. So some countries that are much more developed with much more resources can respond to those impacts in a faster time, bringing relief to their populations immediately. In many of the developing countries, they're not able to do that. And so you have more lives lost, you have more livelihoods lost as well. So one of the important objectives for all of us, and certainly as Secretary General I would advocate for this, is for countries to be given the kind of resources they need to build their resilience, because that would be very, very important. So the negotiations, member states conduct those negotiations, but the practical things that we can do on the ground is where I would want to focus my advocacy. My city, Georgetown, is 2 meters below sea level. So we have a wall to keep the sea out. Just a meter of that wall is thousands of dollars to build. And so if you don't have the resources, you are going to suffer. But this is just, I just mentioned my country, but many, many countries face this. So I would prioritize that. And civil society, young people, I think in the world we live in today, civil society, young people represent a large part of the moral conscience of this world. And that work must continue. And as Secretary General, I would certainly want to continue to have this kind of interaction with civil society. You will hear every day from member states, and you have to listen to member states, but a Secretary General must also listen And that requires listening to others, including civil society.
You can listen. What do you say to governments who treat the energy transition as a commitment rather than an obligation?
We have to work with these countries. I do not believe in lecturing anyone. I believe in engagement. I think that there's need for engagement in this. And so you may have some countries right now that may have a different view, but I think that we have, the great majority of us, if not all of us, subscribe to the Paris Agreement. And so the commitments are made. So engagement with all countries, I think, is extremely important. And that's what I would want to do, engage.
Do you think you've got the right process? Do you think you have the right process in place now to sort out this problem?
The Secretary General has convening power. The Secretary General can speak, to leaders. And every year in my time as Foreign Minister, and even these last 6 years as permanent representative, every year my President asked to see the Secretary General. And the Secretary General meets with a lot of leaders during that time, but otherwise as well. And so that's an opportunity to engage.
Okay, let's move on to the UN humanitarian system, which obviously gets a lot of attention. This is a question submitted by Freddie Carver from the ODI. Here's his question, Carolyn. The UN-led humanitarian system receives criticism from all sides for failing to meet the primary needs of crisis-affected populations, particularly around safety and security, for being bloated, fragmented and inefficient, and for its domination of funding and space at the expense of local and national actors. So far, the response to the funding challenges of recent years has been characterised by a focus on cost-cutting and prioritisation rather than addressing these bigger strategic issues. So, how do you feel that the UN can best rise to these challenges, and where would you start?
I mentioned earlier that part of the challenges we face is a ballooning humanitarian crisis. And on the Security Council, we would receive very regular updates on different situations, on different files. And I was always amazed at what was needed in terms of money and what was being spent, a big difference. We never received the amount of money you need for the particular humanitarian crisis. And I always wondered what happened when we don't receive it. How many people die because of this and so on. But I'm well aware of the complaints as well, that we need to be more efficient, we need to be more effective, we need to buy from local producers for some of the situations where we can do that. And a lot of good work has been done in recent times on this. I know that the head of OCHA, Mr. Tom Fletcher, has been focusing on quite a bit on this. But donors are demanding more efficiency, more accountability as well. And so I certainly would be looking to see what can be done to make this more efficient, more effective, and so that more goes to the people on the ground and not in administrative fees, for example.
Was that the answer to the question when you were looking as to why it wasn't happening? Were people mistrustful of the system? Is that what you found?
No, it was more that the space for the provision of finances was shrinking. Many countries, for example, were spending more on defense, some of them out of necessity. And so the amount for humanitarian assistance was reducing as well. So generally, a lot of countries are facing fiscal challenges. And so the amounts provided, and I want to thank all of those who continue to provide large sums. But also, what I've heard from some member states, including in this campaign, is that when we go to our taxpayers, we have to listen to them. And if they don't believe in the UN, we have a problem with putting money there as well. And so I think our communication has to improve, how we communicate with the work that the UN is doing, what a dollar means in one of these conflict areas to a child that just needs to eat to survive, to see tomorrow.
Would you make that a priority if you were Secretary General, getting this money paid in larger amounts?
Yes, I have an important role to advocate for more resources for the UN, especially for the humanitarian needs that's ballooning out there.
Okay. The next question that we received was about the UN's independence and the influence of major donors. This came from Hannah Mosavi from Pomegranate House in the United Kingdom. They're in their 30s or 40s. And here's the question, Carolyn. Given the rapidly changing global environment, including shifting funding streams and the growing influence of major donors, how will you safeguard the integrity and independence of the UN so it continues to serve all nations rather than the interests of the most powerful?
Not such an easy job being Secretary General anyway. And so any Secretary General will have to be prepared to walk between the raindrops. Maybe sometimes you'll get wet. But certainly in the interactive dialogue, you might have seen this as well, that I had with member states of the UN. The issue of representation of underrepresented and unrepresented countries in the Secretariat was one that was said by many, many delegations. They want to see the UN looking like the world, and that would be a balancing act that one must do, and I'll do my best at it.
What do you mean by getting wet?
Well, not everyone sometimes agrees with what the Secretary General says, or not everyone agrees with what is being proposed to them. But the Secretary General has a role to do that. Wet could mean rejected, but I'm prepared to.
So is it important for you to shift the overall dynamic of power in the United Nations to reflect the world, and how would you do that?
Well, I think that traditionally, there are certain traditions in the Secretary. And the 9 men that came before me were not, that if should I be appointed, I would say. But the 9 men who were Secretary General before, they had to manage that. And I want to learn from them, and I've had the opportunity to speak to at least one of them. And so I'm not at all oblivious to the challenges with this. I cannot go into detail in terms of what I would do, but certainly I would want to work with member states to, even if it's some small movements, to make those.
Ambassador, would you be a disruptor?
What do you mean by a disruptor?
Would you go in and try and change things and get wet?
Mark, I said I'd be pragmatic and I'd be realistic. That's what I'd be.
Would you be radical?
I was never radical because in my life, in my career, I did not see radicalism resulting in what you would like to see happen. I saw massaging help. I saw chipping away at the mountain and not dynamiting it helped. And that resulted in many good things for the people I was representing.
Okay, so your approach is pragmatism, chipping away at things. And that's what served well in the past, and that's where you've seen the results come from. Let's turn to the issue of human rights now. Oumou Diallo from the Association de Familles de Martyrs du Sénégal, apologies for any mispronunciations there. They're in their 30s and 40s from Senegal, 30s or 40s from Senegal. And here's Oumou's question for you, Carolyn. How would you strengthen accountability and protection for victims of political repression in countries where state institutions are perceived as unwilling or unable to investigate abuses independently?
As I mentioned in my vision statement, human rights should be across all the operations of the UN. And this is what as Secretary General I would ensure. We have the Human Rights Council, that's a council of member states elected by member states that have the power to appoint rapporteurs, and those rapporteurs produce reports that are also out there. I would say for me as Secretary General, it would be important when we see those situations requiring the voice of the Secretary General to speak. But let me also say this, that I have seen in my time that sometimes we do not work with member states to improve human rights. And we need to do more of that, I think, to work with member states to improve human rights. I came 3 times to Geneva to present my country's universal periodic report. And I've listened many times to the questions that come from member states. And in some cases, there's a disconnect between what is happening on the ground and the questions that come. So I think working with countries to improve their human rights record as a partner, is very, very important. Sometimes that's not possible, but I think we should try.
What's the disconnect?
For example, on one occasion, I was presenting on the work that we were doing on poverty reduction in my country, and all the challenges we were facing on financing, on things like that. And the question that came to me was about how do you intend to change a couple of laws in nothing to do with what was presented, because I was looking forward for a question, how do you see us working together to improve concessional financing, for example. And so I think the context is important, because if you live in a country with a particular context, that might not be the solution for this other country that you're speaking about. That's what I'm saying. I will not go into further details. But I think the idea is about partnership. How do we partner, for example?
Okay, very interesting. The next question is about peace and security. And this has come from Anne Caparov from the United Nations in America, and they're in their 50s or 60s. And this is Anne's question to you, Carolyn. The UN was founded to maintain international peace and security, as what you mentioned. Yet critics argue it is increasingly absent from critical peace efforts. As Secretary General, how would you restore the organisation's relevance, good offices, and trusted role in conflict diplomacy? Good luck.
As I mentioned, I will try. There are certain tools at the disposal of the Secretary General, as I mentioned, mediation, good offices, and I would certainly use those tools in the situations where those tools can be used. I want to be the Secretary General that would not be afraid to pick up the phone and call, to talk to the conflict parties, to talk to other stakeholders, and to work with those who are in the mediation space now. So, advance peace. When the UN was formed, we did not have the number of regional organizations we have now, for example. And working with those regional organizations is extremely important. I've seen how in my region, CARICOM, a group of former prime ministers worked with Haiti on their political process. It's a lot of work, but they have been doing, and they've been doing this together with the UN. So the UN is there, but sometimes you have to discern, as Secretary General, when the solution can be met earlier by those who are working on the ground, and when you should be the one leading this. And so I would want to work in partnership with these various groups, and then also as you make the UN available, make the UN present, as was said there. Be not afraid to take risks. We are living in some very challenging times, but the Secretary General has to take risks.
Yeah, I wonder what risks you would take, and it's interesting how would you diagnose this? So Anne's writing in saying the UN is increasingly absent from critical peace efforts. We look at what's going on in Ukraine. We look at the Middle East over the last couple of years, 3 or 4 years. First of all, I think you need to diagnose the problem. Is there a problem? Should the UN have been more involved in those conflicts that are going on and on?
Well, one has to also analyze whether the UN was rejected as well. And I may not have all the information available to me on what was tried and was rejected. But I have seen as well in my other life where there were countries in conflict that did not even want a discussion in the Security Council, let alone have the UN involved. And so I think that it's not, in some cases it might not be that the UN did not try. In some cases maybe the UN needed to do more, to try more. And that's what I'm saying I will do, to try more for the UN to be present. But let me say this, Mark, that even when there are other efforts that are happening elsewhere, they bring it to the UN in the final analysis. And we've seen this in the situation of Haiti, we've seen this in the situation of the JCPOA, we've seen this in the situation of the recent resolution that was passed on Gaza. Those discussions happened outside of the UN, started outside of the UN, but they were brought back to the UN for validation, for greater legitimacy, I would say, because then the Security Council decisions and resolutions are binding on all. And so it was brought there for that. And so I think that that must be recognized as well. But not everything is also in the public eye. And so I would be very careful with my criticisms unless I'm able to get all the information on what was tried. But I can tell you, there were cases where I know the countries did not want the UN involved at that time.
If you're taking questions from the audience,
We will
could I
do,
come
yeah.
in on this one?
Yes, great. All right. Well, I'll note you as the first question. So
Okay,
you
thank
keep your. Don't have to put your hand up at that time. I've got it. I'm nearly there. Thank you. In order to get to that stage where the UN signs off a deal, as you're talking about, are you saying your strategy is one of devolution? You're suggesting that you'd use your local and regional offices more, so Secretary General, you do what kind of the Burnhamism. Burnhamism is going to be in the UK, where they set up an office in the north of the country and devolve lots of different economic and political powers. Is that your strategy? You think it's going to be more effective to solve these if you use regional bodies within the UN? Is that how it can become more effective at bringing peace to this world?
Each situation may require a different strategy. One where the UN may lead, one where the UN might be a partner with a regional organization, one where the UN may be alongside a mediator. There would be different scenarios. There are different actors in the field right now.
But do you accept things have to change?
The UN is not the only. Yes, things have to change. We're living in a different world now to when the Charter, the Charter remains relevant, of course, and the Secretary General has to be biased only to the Charter. But what I'm saying is that the UN is not the only organization or the only player in a number of these situations. The centrality of the UN, I agree, must remain important. Hence my point about a lot of the roads lead back to the UN for that greater legitimacy. But I'm not saying that a Secretary General will say, you guys deal with the problem out there, and when you finish, come to us. No, each situation will require a different approach.
Okay, but we'll return to this topic in a moment. Let's turn now to civil society. This was a question sent in by Temitayo Olatunde from the Temba Empowerment Foundation in the UK. They're in their 20s or 30s. Temitayo's question, Karen, is civil society organisations, particularly those led by young people in the global south, face persistent barriers to meaningful UN participation, including accreditation delays, funding gaps, and exclusion from decision-making. What concrete steps will you take to ensure civil society is genuinely included in shaping UN policy, not merely consulted?
I mentioned the work that was done with civil society when I co-facilitated the establishment of the Youth Office and also the Declaration on Universal Health Coverage. And civil society now are connected by just a mobile phone in their hands. And what we did there was we used the social media platforms to connect with civil society, but we also held a meeting with civil society to hear their contributions to the resolution that we were going to pass as member states. The UN is a member states driven organization, but the role of civil society is extremely important, and we have to find innovative ways of including civil society. One of the things that we have done, or member states have done in the General Assembly, is in addition to accreditation of civil society organizations through ECOSOC, in the resolutions for the meeting themselves now, they are including in it civil society participation. So you don't have to go through that whole process of the ECOSOC accreditation, which is very important, I believe, for organizations wanting to have that long-term accreditation, but also through the resolutions that are being passed. I agree that civil society should not just be a bystander in this. And I've seen civil society very active. For example, in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the rooms are overflowing with civil society, and I go there to listen to them. As a member state, I would go there to listen to what they're saying. And sometimes I went there to listen to some of them criticize my country, civil society from my country. And one of the things that we've done with that was, have you contacted anybody back home with your concerns? Because I would like to facilitate that if you haven't been able to do that. And then we learned that no, there was no contact. But try to have a partnership with civil society. There's an important role. And so, as Secretary General, I would want to continue that engagement with civil society. I've seen the usefulness of it, and I've seen when it's a partnership situation that with member states, things can work.
And when they were criticizing your country, were they talking about its climate record?
No, it was the two occasions. It was about they wanted to see some change in the law. In one of the laws, they wanted to see that change, and on another occasion is they wanted to be more involved in one of the processes we had back home in our low carbon development strategy. But when I checked, the particular organizations were invited to the meetings, but they didn't come. And so I encouraged them to go to the meetings and to put forward their proposals.
But you followed it up with them?
Yes, they did not attend.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you were listening. And this is a question about justice for grave violations. We're covering obviously a whole array of topics here. This has been submitted by Mandeep Tiwana from Civicus. She's in India, in their 40s or 50s. And Mandeep's question is, how will you ensure justice for victims of the gravest violations of the UN Charter, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes through the UN?
There are different processes for this, and there are different institutions as well, the ICJ. One of the things I mentioned in my vision statement, though, is that I will want to use Article 99, to trigger Article 99 of the Charter when I see that we can have a really big problem, like protection of civilians in a particular conflict. It has not been used many times, this article, for the Secretary General to trigger that and for the Security Council to convene. And I've been asked, when will you, in what situations would you do that? And I've said that, for example, I would use the criterion of when civilians are at great risk, for example. The Secretary General has a voice, and we have seen how that voice has been used in the past, and I will continue to do that where we see grave violations taking place. That's a full-time job of the Secretary General.
You said you would trigger it. You've been asked about that in the past.
Yes, because there's some concerns here.
Are there examples that you can share with the audience here about when you would have used that in the past?
No, the Secretary General has to do. I'm not Secretary General yet.
No, but had you been Secretary General in the past few years, are there examples of situations where you think it should have been used?
There was one example where it was used, and I thought the recent one in the situation in Gaza, and I think that was a decision by the Secretary General.
And you think there are other examples around the world?
I would have to look at the other examples.
Okay. Let's turn to the audience. I'll ask you one final question, so we'll come straight to you, madam, and then please have a think about your questions. Your final question from me for now is that if you were confirmed as Secretary General, the youngest of the candidates, congratulations, tomorrow you've been made Secretary General, what would your first priority be, and who would you call first?
I'll call Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General, and ask him for us to have coffee and to tell me what to look out for. I can't ask him that now, he's still the Secretary General, but I would want to, in the first few months, the humanitarian situation was raised, I would want to ensure that I have a very full view of that and what we can do, because it's about life and death. It's about livelihoods of people as well. We want to see what more we can do there. I would look at the issue of representation as well, and what we can do there. And I would certainly look at all of the conflicts that the UN is, that's on the UN's list, I would say, and what we can do there, how I can use the tools at my disposal, and where I need to go to the Security Council, for example. So, and last but not least in that lineup would be engagement with the international financial institutions on the development side, because the SDGs are not being achieved in part because of the lack of financing, and we need to make some progress in that. The world has never been as rich as it is financially, and yet we have the situation. We have to find innovative ways.
Busy first day that you've outlined there. And thank you for answering all those questions that have been submitted from a number of different areas, as you saw there, and for taking some of mine. Now let's turn to the audience. I can think of one person who wants to ask a question straight away. Maybe you want to say your name and where you're from, if you like, and the microphone's coming your way.
Thank you. I'm Susan Talbot, UNA Blackheath and Greenwich and Westminster branches, and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, on conflict diplomacy and improving conflict diplomacy. The experience over more than 30 years is that including women peacemakers in peace talks produces longer lasting agreements. And yet in some discussions, for example, the present talks, Iran, the United States of America, and Israel, there are no women involved at all. One understands that the women's movement is sometimes reluctant to come forward and appear to sponsor a head of state of whom they disapprove on feminist grounds, but it should be possible to include women peacemakers without them actually saying, okay, well, we think this is a good head of state. What can you do to improve the situation and to ensure that these women peacemakers are properly funded?
Thank you.
Yes, your assertion that when women are involved in peacemaking, the solutions are more sustainable, that is backed up with all the evidence. And you're right that I think the last statistic I had was that we only had about 16% of women involved in some of the peace processes, in the negotiations that were taking place in different conflict situations. So there's that gap. In terms of the discussions that are taking place that are outside of the UN, of course, it would not be right for the Secretary General to dictate to the states that are involved in that. But certainly the UN can work with women on the ground. And we've seen the improvement, for example, where women peacekeepers, that has increased. Still not very high, but that has increased. And when you talk with the troop contributing countries, how that has helped, it's all very, very positive. So we have to continue to advocate for more women in peacekeeping, more women in peace processes, because the other side of the story is that women and children are the ones that are most affected by these conflicts. And so they should be part of the solution. They must be part of the solution.
There's a question over there. And that question there. Why don't we both ask your questions and then we'll take both of them together. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Simpson from the Peace Center for Women's Rights, and I truly welcome your candidacy, Madam Ambassador. My question is related to the previous question, and it's whether you would plan to take a feminist approach to the job as Secretary General and what that means to you.
And we'll just get this question.
Thank you. If feminism is about being fair, promoting gender equality, non-discrimination against women, of course, this is, all of us should be feminists in that respect. So certainly, I think that what we face sometimes is where different people have different ideas of what feminism is. But in my view, it's just a matter of fairness in opportunities, in representation, and that we must all work to ensure.
Thank you. I'm Sudha Srivastava from Smart Sustainable Solutions, working to localize sustainable development goals, mentoring, working with young people and children, based in London. My question is about, we are hoping for a women Secretary General. It's a long hope, and I know many people in this room and many people hearing us across the globe are looking for women Secretary General this time. And so my question is, what are your priorities for young girls and young women? What kind of a difference you're going to make as a woman, as a woman Secretary General in future when you are elected? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I've always practiced in my life an advocate for women's involvement in every sphere of life, including political life, and for young girls and women and girls, young women and girls, to have the education that they deserve. And I will continue to do that as Secretary General, but let me say that when Guyana was on the Security Council, 90% of our team, they were women. We had only one man, and I begged my minister, could I have at least one other man for some balance and perspective, because I believe that we need perspectives from both. But I've had the benefit of working with women. I am a woman, and I haven't seen that there is a difference in performance. Because one of the things I keep hearing from time to time is, yes, we need a woman, but we need a competent woman. And I don't really hear that we need a man, but a competent man. So I think that is something that I've noticed in this. But let me say this. I've heard also that someone said to me, you must demonstrate strength, because if you want to be Secretary General, you must show that you're, like a man. And I'm like, well, I cannot be a man. And strength doesn't always have to be shown. We bring children into this world. That is some level of strength. And the women who brought forth the men who were Secretary General before, I'm sure were strong women. So why not a woman now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Diana Magney. I'm a journalist for Sky News, but I'm here really in a personal capacity, and I love what you just said, and also welcome a female candidacy. That's fantastic. My question is about AI, which will clearly have a massive impact on international peace and security, for better or for worse. I wondered if you've read the Pope's encyclical letter, what your response to it is, how you would work to ensure that AI does work for the benefit of humanity as Secretary General. Thank you.
Yes, I have. A very important piece of writing by the Pope. And let me say this, that I have seen in the US, for example, where at graduation ceremonies, students were booing when AI was mentioned. And part of that, I believe, is they are fearful of what it means for them, for jobs, for creativity. If you can use AI to create, what would that mean for humans? And so there's that concern. On the other hand, there's the view that AI can be a force for good as well. And so how we balance addressing those concerns of people who are fearful of the displacement AI will cause, and also those who do not want to stifle innovation and creativity in terms of technology will be important. And that is where the governance aspect of AI comes in. And the UN just had a meeting in Geneva on the governance of AI. We're not yet near to putting ink to paper on a convention, but I think we would have to get there, because you have to have guardrails. And I think it was the Pope who said it, I might not be right here, not everything you can create is something for good. But I think in this case, we have to see how we can use AI for good and address the disruptions that it could cause. But it reminds me of when the internet came into being and we were all very concerned as well. We've moved a bit, but this one is moving at a much faster pace. So hopefully member states would be able to come to that point of having a convention negotiated on the governance of AI. The discussions are flowing in that direction, I see.
There's a lady over there and there's a gentleman behind you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your time. I think this sort of links a couple of those questions. I'm also a WILF member. I'm a director of Civic Space, which is a charity that works on satellite data for humanitarian support. On the changing structure and proposals of the UN system, there are regional mandates, there are various pillars, and of course there is work on sort of decentralizing away from the sort of New York, Geneva, partly for financial reasons. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts, particularly in the context of technology, how systems like AI, particularly in the area of satellite data and support, what you consider is a way forward with regard to the tension between the confidentiality that's expected and required for mediation, peacekeeping, the UN peacekeepers, of course, of UNDP, and of course ceasefire and monitoring, with public data, verification protocols, and trust and confidence building mechanisms in, as you rightly said, a time of declining trust. A lot of those technologies cause problems in and of themselves. They have become new actors, problematic actors in and of themselves, rather than facilitators. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts, I know it's not a simple answer, around the approach for the UN, particularly as a person of the indigenous community and a woman, in a way that respects local agency and doesn't steamroll them, but also enables those delicate processes without causing further bias implications. And thank you for your time.
Yes, we could have a whole seminar on this, but it is an extremely important question. I see us being able to use AI for early warning, because a conflict does not just happen in a day. Things happen before that. And I think if we're able to use technology in that way, we would be able to have the kind of information that's needed to give us the trigger for some preventive measure, for example. And I've also seen where we've been using technology in certain situations to deconflict, for example, where drones have been used to do this in some situations. I recall in one situation, one of the SRSGs was saying they were not getting the permission to use the drones, and so they could not go, the drones had to go ahead before. So there's a positive side of it there. But I've also seen where diplomacy has sort of suffered a bit because of technology, social media, and so on. There's a need for, and populations are demanding, if a negotiations is happening, what did you do today? What happened today? What, you know, and many times you need to have that information confidential, that is not something that you can just, it's painstaking work that you have to do in mediation. So there's also a need for balancing there what you let out in terms of the information as well. But the Twitter diplomacy, the Facebook diplomacy, and those kinds of things, you know, it's happening as we speak. And the protection of mediators as well. Just recently I heard about one instance where names of people being involved in the mediation was made, you know, public through, you know, technology, and it caused challenges for their protection and their security. So there are a lot of aspects to this. In terms of the indigenous communities, I see that quite a number of them, at least in my country, are trying to use technology. For example, in conservation, and environmental work that they're doing. They're using technology to protect different species, to protect the forest and so on. So I think the whole thing is how we balance the good and how we mitigate the bad.
We have time for one more question?
Yes.
Is that be all right? Okay. Is there time for one more question if somebody wants to ask? There was a hand there. There we go. Great.
My name is Ali. I'm from Al Khoury Foundation in the holy city of Jeju Forum. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish you all the luck in the world. It's great listening to what you have to say. My question is about engagement with the religious establishment and faith actors. We've seen that during conflicts, even in secular societies, many times people seek the guidance of the faith sector, of religious clergy, and it's very important that the clerics working, especially with the grassroots, engaging with the local population, is supported by the high establishments, by the UN, for example. So what's the role that you see the faith actors play in times of conflict resolution, and what support do you have in mind in supporting that during this time? Thank you.
And thank you. In fact, in one of the negotiation processes that I was involved in, and this was a recommendation by the Holy See in that process, was to include in the particular resolution on health the work of faith-based organizations. Sadly, it did not succeed in getting into the resolution because some countries did not want it included. But I've also seen on the ground the work that faith-based organizations have been involved in. In many instances, sometimes they are the first responders in some situations. And I know that on the ground, the UN has been working with the faith-based organizations in some countries. And I think once that is working, we should ensure that we do more of that. But different situations, I think, will require different actors. In some cases, countries may even ask for, the imam or the priest or, the pandit to be involved. The cases that I know of. So there is a role for faith-based organizations in different situations.
Thank you. You don't want to weigh out before the Foreign Secretary. Brilliant questions, excellent questions on AI, on faith, and reading the room very much about feminism. I have one final question. I studied feminist methodologies. I really believe that there's an extra element that women can give, not just because I've got a 3.5-year-old who I think is going to rule the world, just because she's got 3 older brothers, so maybe that's toughening her up. But my question really is, just hypothetically, if you had a slightly unhinged global leader in his 80s, leading one of the countries around the world, and he was a bit all over the place and causing all sorts of things to happen that the UN maybe would want to get involved in, how would you deal with somebody like that?
I don't deal with hypotheticals.
but it's a serious question. How would you negotiate? You mentioned you're going to be very pragmatic. January is not that far away. If that wasn't a hypothetical, how would you deal with the President of the United States?
The United States is basically one of the midwives of the UN, if not the main midwife. The United States was very instrumental in the formation of the United Nations. It's the largest contributor to the United Nations. It's the host country of the United Nations. And of course, it's an equal member of the United Nations. And as Secretary General, I have to engage with everyone, with every member state. And the United States will be, of course, an important country for engagement and the leadership of the United States. I think that goes without saying. And so, yes, that's what I will certainly aim to do.
Diplomacy in action. Just make sure the escalators are working when they visit, perhaps. Look, I can't thank you enough for your time. On behalf of the United Nations Association UK, who have kindly hosted this fascinating event to allow this civil dialogue to take place for this very transparent process in the choice of the world's biggest, greatest diplomat, which is coming very soon down the line. Thank you so much for fitting us all and all our questions into your day, which is a very busy one, as we've said, and you're off to see the Foreign Secretary now. There were other hustings that were held by the United Nations Associations, all available on the YouTube channel. So do go back and watch that and compare and contrast. There's a lot of information there. It was fascinating, that hustings, and there was even a write-up. If you don't have time to watch the video, you can even read the write-up. That's all online. Just go to the United Nations UK Association website. But finally, we just want to really thank you for engaging wholeheartedly in all our questions and really giving us a sense of who you are and what you would do if you got this prestigious job. So a huge round of applause, please.
Let me just quickly thank you. It always gives me not only pleasure but hope to meet with people from outside of the UN. Of course, I see folks in the UN all the time, but people that are out here that want to see a better UN, want to see an effective UN, want to see a present UN, and your voices need to be heard. And I'm really happy that I'd had this opportunity to be here and to listen to your questions, but also to provide my answers. So keep doing what you're doing. You are part of the United Nations. We are all the United Nations. So thank you for having me, but more than that, thank you for all that you do.